My name is Morin. On my 18th birthday, my parents set my things by the door in 2 trash bags, handed me a $500 check, and told me the family didn't need me anymore. I had nursed my grandmother to her last breath. That, they decided, made me the help, not the heir. They kept the house, they kept her money, they kept everything. My mother kissed my cheek, called me sweetheart, and locked the door. I didn't argue. I walked. 7 years later, they drove up to a gate with my name on the deed. A $700,000 home. "We're family," my mother said. "We should live here too." They had no idea what I'd already found or what I'd done with it. They were still saying the word family when I said 5 words. My mother went white, but before the gate, there was a morning, and long before that morning, there was a door. This is the story of the family that kept everything, and the one thing they never knew they'd left behind. Okay, it was the last quiet morning before her name came back. The coffee was the first warm thing my hands found that morning. I wrapped both palms around the mug and stood at the kitchen window, watching the gate at the end of my drive. It stayed closed. Long gravel, a row of bare maples, then the iron gate with my name on the deed behind it. The house held a particular kind of quiet. Not empty, settled, the quiet of a place nobody could ask me to leave. I said it under my breath. Mine. Every nail of it. 7 years ago, I'd owned nothing at all. The kettle ticked as it cooled. On the shelf above the stove sat an old recipe tin, dented at one corner, the paint worn down to tin at the edges. It had moved with me 11 times. It would not be moving again. There was a manila folder on the counter I hadn't opened yet. I left it there. Some mornings you let the day arrive before you let it in. By 8, I was at the office. Marigold In-Home Care has 2 desks, a coffee machine that lies about being decaf, and a wall of index cards. One for every client. Around 60 cards now, 40 caregivers to cover them. We send people into other people's homes to do the work nobody wants to talk about. Bathing, feeding, sitting through the long middle of the night so a daughter 2 states away can sleep. Yvonne was already there, reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, frowning at a schedule. "You're early?" she said, not looking up. "You're earlier." "I'm always earlier. It's my one personality trait." She slid a coffee across the desk toward me, the way she had the first day we met. "Mrs. Okafor's daughter called. She wants to know if you can do the visit personally. Says her mother only settles for you." I took the cup. "I'll go at 11. You don't have to do the floors anymore, you know. You own the company." "I know." I went anyway. I always went. That morning's visit was a man named Mr. Lindqvist, 90, a retired machinist whose hands shook too badly now to button his own shirt. He hated needing help. You could see it in his jaw. So I didn't announce the buttons. I talked about the Twins' bullpen and did them one at a time while he argued about relief pitching. And by the time the shirt was done, he had forgotten to be ashamed. That is the part the big agencies cannot bill for and do not bother to try. The buttons take a minute. The not shaming takes everything you are. On the shelf by the office door, beside the spare keys and the first aid kit, sat a second tin. A cheap copy I'd bought years ago because I couldn't stand the original being out of arm's reach and couldn't stand carrying it to work. People thought it was decoration. That tin came with me out of one house into all the rest. That afternoon, my phone lit up on the stone counter while I was washing a single cup. A name I hadn't let myself see in 7 years. Then a message, gray bubble, 3 lines. "Marin, it's Mom. We need to talk about family." I dried the cup, set it in the rack, looked at the screen until it went dark on its own. I didn't open it, not yet, because to understand the gate, you have to understand the door. I was 14 the winter my grandmother came to live with us. She arrived in the back of my father's car with 2 suitcases and an oxygen tank, and the spare room became her room. And within a month, the rhythm of the house had reorganized itself around her lungs. My mother called a family meeting at the kitchen table. She loved a family meeting, and announced in her soft church voice how we would all pitch in. All of us meant me. "You're so good with her, sweetheart," my mother said, smoothing my hair down with one hand. "You have the patience for it. Whitney has school." Whitney was 16 and had school. I had school too. Nobody said that part out loud, so the mornings became mine. I learned to hear the difference between the cough that meant nothing and the cough that meant call someone. I learned which pillow under which knee. I missed homeroom, then whole mornings, then enough that the counselor stopped calling. My grades didn't fail so much as quietly slide off the table. When report cards came, my father glanced at mine and said, "She's needed at home," and that was the end of the conversation. Whitney got a car that year, for school. There was a night that February when my grandmother spiked a fever and her breathing turned to wet paper. And I sat up with her until the panic passed, counting her breaths against the clock on the nightstand. I had a geometry test the next morning. I missed it. When I asked my mother to write a note, she said the school would understand, and she never wrote it, and the 0 stood. By spring, I had stopped asking. The teachers stopped asking too. It is a strange thing to disappear from a place while you are still technically enrolled in it. Nobody marks the day you become invisible. You only notice later that it already happened. I wiped my grandmother's face with a warm cloth at 6 in the morning, and she watched me with eyes that hadn't dimmed at all. And once she caught my wrist and said, "You're missing your own life in here." "I don't mind," I said. I half meant it. Whitney had school. I had Grandma. There were good hours, too. I want that on the record. In the afternoons, when the house was empty and the light came in low and yellow, my grandmother would send me to the kitchen for the tin. Lemon cake. Always lemon cake. She'd kept the recipe in her head and on a stained index card for 50 years, and she'd cut me a slice the size of 2 slices and press a finger to her lips. "Don't tell your mother," she'd say. We'd eat cake at 3 in the afternoon like criminals. She taught me the recipe by feel, not by card. A little more lemon than you think, cold butter, don't overwork it. "Your mother bakes it from the card and it comes out fine," she said once. "You bake it from memory and it comes out like mine. There's a difference. Remember the difference." I didn't understand then that she was telling me something larger than cake. "You see people, Marin," she told me once, halfway through a slice, crumbs on the quilt. "Most folks look right past the ones doing the quiet work. You don't. That's not nothing." "It's just cake, Grandma." "It's not the cake." She tapped the back of my hand. "Don't let them tell you it's nothing." She saw me. I held on to that for years. January came and the coughs all started meaning the same thing. The last night, I sat on the edge of her bed with my hand in hers. Her grip had almost no strength left in it, but she found mine in the dark and held on. The oxygen machine breathed for both of us. The room smelled of menthol and clean sheets. She pulled my hand toward the nightstand, toward the tin she'd asked me to bring up that evening, and pressed it against my fingers until I took the weight of it. "These are yours, Marin," she said. "All of them." Her eyes stayed on me until they didn't. The machine kept breathing. I didn't move to turn it off. I sat there with the tin in my lap and her hand cooling in mine, and somewhere down the hall, a door clicked shut, and the world went very far away and very small at the same time. I remember small, wrong things. The second hand on the nightstand clock, still going. A car passing outside, someone's headlights crossing the ceiling and sliding off. The fact that I was still holding the warm cloth I'd used on her face an hour before, and that it had gone cold in my hand without my noticing. I don't know how long I sat. When my mother finally came in, the tea I'd made was cold on the dresser, and I hadn't touched it. She looked at the machine, and then at me, and the first thing she said was not her mother's name. It was, "We'll need to make calls in the morning." I thought she meant the recipes. I would not understand what she meant for 7 more years. 2 months later, I turned 18. There was no cake. There were 2 black trash bags by the front door, fat and knotted, and my whole life was inside them. My father stood in the entryway with an envelope. My mother stood beside him with her hands folded, the way she stood at the front of the church. My father held out the envelope. Inside was a check, $500. On the memo line, in his square handwriting, 2 words, "Services rendered." "500 for your trouble," he said. "It's more than fair." There was a single sheet of paper folded behind the check. Typed, a list, my grandmother's accounts, her savings, what went where, my mother's name, Whitney's name, not mine. I read it twice while they watched. My mother crossed the entryway and cupped my cheek in her warm, dry hand. She smelled like the perfume she'd worn my whole life. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "the family doesn't need you anymore." I didn't argue. I've gone back over that morning more times than I can count, looking for the version where I screamed, and it isn't there. I took the envelope, I took the folded page. I slid my phone out and, without quite deciding to, photographed the check on the entryway table. The amount, the memo, the date. Then I picked up both bags. The tin was already in my coat, against my ribs, where it had been since January. I stood on the threshold a moment with the bags in my hands, waiting, I don't know for what, for one of them to laugh and say it was a test, for my father to take the page back. Neither of them moved. My mother had already turned toward the kitchen, the way you turn from a guest who's overstayed. The handles cut into my fingers. I stepped onto the porch. Behind me, the deadbolt turned. One sound, final, an envelope and a closed door. I stood on the step for a moment with a bag in each hand, and nowhere in particular to be. Then I went down the driveway and didn't look back at the window, because I already knew no one would be standing in it. I didn't fight. I filed it away, literally. The first night I spent in a bus shelter on Route 14 because the motel wanted $40 I wasn't ready to spend yet, and the shelter had a roof. I cashed the check the next morning because pride doesn't pay for a room. After the motel and a sandwich and a bus pass, I counted what was left. I had a tin of recipes and $412. I'd photographed the check before I signed it over. I didn't know why. It just seemed like the kind of thing a person should keep a picture of, proof that someone had put a number on you. The motel had a cracked window and a radiator that knocked all night. I pressed my cheek against the cold glass and watched the parking lot and did not cry, because crying felt like a thing you did when someone was coming, and nobody was coming. I made what was left last 6 weeks. I learned which gas station let you refill a coffee for free if you bought it once. I slept in the day room of the shelter when the motel money ran out, and I kept the tin inside my jacket the whole time because it was the only thing I owned that no one could put a price on. I had checked. There was no number on it. There was a number on me. So I went. I got a job wiping tables, then a better one in a memory care unit, mopping and changing linens on the overnight. I took the GED at a community college on a Saturday with a room full of people twice my age. I passed. Then I started a certified nursing assistant program at night and worked the floors during the day. And somewhere in there, I stopped being a girl. Things happened too. The unit is where I met Yvonne. She was a registered nurse with 30 years on me and no patience for anything fake. She watched me feed a man named Walter, who hadn't let anyone feed him in a week, watched me wait him out, spoon down, talking about the twins until he opened his mouth. She came over afterward with 2 coffees and pushed one across the table at me. "You've got the hands for this," she said. "People can feel it. You can't teach that." It was the second time in my life someone had told me the quiet work was worth something. The first was my grandmother. The thing they mocked was the thing that fed me. Yvonne and I talked for a year before we did anything about it, about how the big agencies treated caregivers like interchangeable parts, billed families a fortune, and paid the aides nothing. About how the work that actually mattered, the sitting, the listening, the dignity, was the work no one would put a price on. "If they won't pay us what care is worth," I said one night over bad diner coffee, "we'll set the price ourselves." We named it Marigold. Yvonne held the clinical license. I ran everything else: the schedules, the billing, the hiring, the 3 a.m. calls when an aide didn't show, and I drove out to cover the shift myself in last night's clothes. The first client was a widower whose son lived in Denver and felt guilty enough to pay for the best. The second was a woman dying the way my grandmother had, slow and proud, and I sat with her at the end the way no one had let me sit with anyone since. Word gets around in a small town. We hired 1 aide, then 4, then a dozen. We grew. Somewhere in those years, back home, the story settled into its final shape. I heard it secondhand once, from a woman at a supply company who didn't know who I was. "Poor Sandra Holt," she said. "Raised that younger girl upright, and the girl just ran off the day she turned 18. Never even came back for the grandmother's funeral. Some people, you just can't help." I set down my pen and let her finish. They were telling my story. I was busy living a different one. I built a life. Then a tin gave me back a past. I closed on the house that February. 7 years, almost to the season, after the door. $700,000, a gate, a long drive, more rooms than one person needs. I didn't pay cash. I'm not a fairy tale. I have a mortgage like everyone else. But I'd put down enough that the banker shook my hand twice. I drove out alone after signing, sat in the empty living room on the floor, and listened to a house that was mine make its small ticking sounds. I unpacked over a week. Books, then dishes, then the things that mattered. I kept finding myself standing in rooms just to stand in them. The bedroom that locked from the inside, the kitchen with its own door to the yard. The second bathroom I would never need and loved anyway, because it was proof. Proof of what? I couldn't have said. Proof that the math had come out different than they'd promised. The last box held the original tin. I set it on the shelf above the stove, and then, because it was finally home and finally still, I took it down again to clean it properly for the first time in years. Home. The word still felt borrowed. I emptied the cards onto the counter. 50 years of recipes in my grandmother's slanted hand. I wiped the inside with a damp cloth. And my thumb caught on the bottom. A seam, a lip of metal that shouldn't have been there. The tin had a false bottom. I worked a butter knife under the edge, and the little panel lifted, and underneath, flat against the base, lay a folded sheet of paper gone soft with age, and a small brass key. I unfolded the paper with hands that had gone unsteady. The first 2 words were my name. My Marin, she left me more than recipes. I sat down on the kitchen floor, the way I had the night she died, and I read my grandmother's last letter under my own roof. My Marin, if you're reading this, the tin finally gave up its secret. Good girl. You always did look closer than the rest of them. You were the one who stayed. The one who held the cup to my mouth at 3 a.m. when the rest of this family was asleep. I saw it. I see you. I made sure that counts. There is a will. A real one, signed and witnessed, not the story they'll tell you. The original is in a safe deposit box at the bank on Main. This key opens it. Talk to Mr. Voss. He drew it up, and he'll know what to do. Half of everything I have is yours. You earned it long before you ever knew it existed. And Maren, don't ever let anyone tell you that caring is small. It is the largest thing one person can do for another. You did the largest thing. Don't forget it. All my love. Grandma. I read it 3 times. Then I pressed it flat against my chest and let the kitchen go blurry, because there are some letters that arrive 7 years too late and exactly on time, both at once. She'd been protecting me the whole way down. The next morning, I took the key to the bank on Main, opened the box, and brought home the will and a stack of papers I didn't stop to read. Then I sat with the phone in my hand and a name circling. I searched it on my laptop. Harlan Voss. Still practicing. Estate and probate, a small firm 2 towns over, the same address my grandmother would have driven to, in a car my father had probably been driving for years by then. I almost didn't call. There's a particular fear in hoping a closed door might open. You've trained yourself not to knock. I made coffee. I let it go cold. Then I made the call before I could talk myself out of it. I called the office and a receptionist answered, and I gave my name. And then I gave the only credential that mattered. I'm Opal's granddaughter, Maren. She told me to find you. There was a pause on the line. Hold for Mr. Voss, she said. She wrote it all down. My grandmother had been protecting me all along. Someone had buried it. Now I had a key, a letter, and an appointment. Harlan Voss's office smelled like old paper and coffee burned down to tar. He was somewhere past 70, soft-spoken with a way of going very still when something mattered. I put the original will on his desk. I put the key beside it. He read the will without touching it for a long moment. Then he opened a drawer, pulled a thin file, and laid a second document next to mine. He compared them line by line, the way you'd check a counterfeit. This is the original, he said finally. I have the copy. I drafted both. Is it valid? It's valid. Signed, witnessed, notarized. Your grandmother left half her residuary estate to you. He took his glasses off. This will was valid. It was never filed. That's a problem. For them. Never filed, I repeated. There was a probate. Just not this one. He turned his copy toward me and tapped a date. 7 years ago, an estate was opened, filed as if there were no will. Your mother served as personal representative. She was your grandmother's only child, so without a will, everything would pass to her by default. The court was told there was no will. You knew there was. I had no idea your grandmother had passed. His voice didn't rise, but something behind it did. No one notified me. A client dies, the family handles things quietly. The lawyer who drew up a will 8 years earlier is the last to hear, if he hears at all. I held a copy in a drawer and waited for a phone call that never came. He looked at the original again. Until you. Never filed. They'd hidden her last wish. He laid out what it meant. Plainly, the way he must have done 100 times across that desk. There were words I'd never had reason to learn. Concealment of a will. A felony in this state. Fraud on the court. He said grounds to reopen probate. He said the word restitution. How is it even possible, I asked, that it sat for 7 years? Because no one with standing came forward, and no one told me. He folded his hands. A will doesn't enforce itself, Maren. It's a piece of paper until someone brings it to a judge. Your grandmother gave the original to the one person she trusted to bring it. You. She just never got the chance to say so. So it waited in a tin while everyone who knew assumed the silence was the truth. And the statute of limitations, fraud is different. The clock can start when the fraud is discovered, not when it was committed. A thin, dry smile. They had 7 good years. That's all they're going to get. There was more in the box, I said. I set the papers between us. I couldn't make sense of them. He could. He went through the stack and laid one in front of me. A bank account, my name on it. A payable on death account my grandmother had opened years before she got sick. $52,000, set aside for the granddaughter who fed her at 3 a.m. Drained. Voss put his finger on the final statement. 52,000, he said quietly. In your name, taken as your guardian 6 weeks after the funeral. You were 17. Legally, your mother could access it on your behalf. She did. It never reached you. I had not known the account existed. I said so. He believed me. The dates did the proving. A minor doesn't drain her own account and then sleep in a bus shelter. I sat with that one longer than the rest. $52,000, set aside for me specifically, by the one person who'd seen me, and spent 6 weeks after we buried her by the woman who'd called me the help. While I was learning which gas station gave free refills, there had been an account with my name on it, paying down someone else's debts. I didn't say any of that to Voss. I just looked at the statement until the number stopped meaning money. He totaled it on a legal pad while I watched. Half the estate, plus the account. A number circled, around $212,000. It wasn't neglect, I said. The room had gone cold around the edges, or I had. It was a decision. Did you keep anything from back then? Voss asked. Anything from when they put you out? I had. I'd kept it for 7 years without knowing why. I came back 2 days later with a thin folder of my own. I set down the photo of the check. $500, services rendered, the date in my father's square hand. I set down the typed page from the entryway, the distribution that listed everyone but me. Voss read the memo line, services rendered. His jaw worked once. I kept everything, I said. I just never knew why. He laid my pieces beside his pieces, and the whole shape of it sat there on the desk. The will they'd buried, the account they'd emptied, the daughter they'd priced at $500 and called the help. Intent, written in their own hands. They kept everything. So did I. The right things. Then I made a choice. I sat in my car in the firm's parking lot for a long time with the folder on the passenger seat. I could have called my mother that night and let her hear it in my voice. I could have driven to the house and stood on the porch where the deadbolt had turned and watched her face do what faces do. There was a version of me, 17 and on a bus, who would have wanted that badly. I didn't want either. The 17-year-old had spent her anger surviving. What was left was colder and more useful. I wanted it done right, on the record, in front of a judge, where it couldn't be talked away by a woman who had talked away worse. I told Voss to reopen the probate. Quietly, to file the fraud claim and the petition, send the formal notice through the proper channels, and not a word before the paperwork was stamped. Quietly, I said. By the book. No warning. He filed it that week. I have the receipt, stamped with the date. I filed before they ever knocked. Quick pause. I want your gut on this. She'd just found what they buried and quietly started the machinery to undo it, weeks before they ever came knocking. If you were her, would you warn them it was coming? Or let them walk straight into it? Tell me what you'd do in the comments. Then stay with me, because what they did next made the choice for me. The truth wasn't a weapon yet. It was just filed. That night, I read the letter again under the kitchen light. I smoothed it flat on the counter beside the tin and read it slowly, the way you read a thing you've decided to memorize. The paper had gone warm under the lamp. Outside the window, the gate sat dark at the end of the drive. Don't let anyone tell you that caring is small. She'd been gone 7 years. My eyes stung, and I let them, alone in my own kitchen, just for a minute, because she still had my back from inside a recipe tin, and there was no one there to call it weakness. Then I folded the letter, set it under the lid, and went to work in the morning like always. The work, that week, was a woman named Mrs. Okafor. She was 86 and sharp as a tack, and furious at her own hands for failing her. I went to her apartment on a Tuesday and combed out her hair while she told me about her late husband, and when I'd finished, she caught my fingers, the way my grandmother used to. "You make me feel like a person," she said, "not a chore." When I got back to the office, the team had taped a card to the door. It was Marigold's anniversary that week. Our very first client, years ago, the widower with the son in Denver. Someone had drawn a marigold on the front. They'd all signed it. Yvonne pretended she hadn't organized it. Inside, there was cake. Not lemon. A grocery store sheet cake with too much frosting, and it was perfect. The aides came through between shifts, in scrubs, tired, and we stood around a break room table, eating cake off paper towels, and someone told a story about a client who proposed to her every Tuesday and forgot by Thursday. We laughed until Yvonne had to take her glasses off. I looked around that little room at the people who did the work my family had thrown out with the trash, and I thought, this is the inheritance. This is the thing she actually left me. The rest is just money. This was the nursemaid work. This was the whole point. The letter on the office desk that afternoon was a different kind. Thick cream paper, a regional health systems logo across the top. Yvonne hovered while I read it, practically vibrating. They wanted to acquire Marigold. They'd named a number. They'd attached a one-page assessment that used the words top-rated agency in the county. The number was $1.8 million. I set it down, picked it up, read it once more. $1.8 million, I said, for wiping chins. Yvonne laughed, then didn't, because she'd heard the old voice in it. 1.8, she said again, quieter. For the thing nobody respects. She looked at me over the glasses. You know what your mother's paying right now to keep her roof? A lot less than that. Neither of us said anything for a moment. We didn't have to. The thing they threw away had a price now. I didn't sell. I told the health system no the next morning. Kindly. Marigold wasn't a thing I'd built to hand off. It was the thing that had built me back. But the offer did something quieter. It set a number on the work my family had thrown out with the trash bags. It made the math impossible to argue with. I lived the same as before. Same office, same floors, same coffee that lied about being decaf. I didn't post about the house or the offer or any of it. I'm not the type. My phone lit up again on the stone counter. A new gray bubble from the same name. Family is family, Maren. Call your mother. I had the letter. I had the will. I had the account statements and the check and the price. But they knew none of it. I had the letter, the will, the receipts, and the price. They had a deadline I didn't know about yet. My mother started calling that spring. Not texting, calling, which she never did. I let it go to voicemail twice, and then, on a Sunday, I answered, because part of me still wanted to hear what the voice would say. Sweetheart. The same warmth. 7 years, switched on like a tap. It's been too long. We've been thinking about you. I held the phone away from my ear a little. She talked about the church, about my father's knees, about a 30th anniversary celebration they were planning at the church hall, and how they wanted to fold in a remembrance for my grandmother, and wouldn't it be right, after all this time, for the family to be together? Not once did she ask how I was. Not once did she ask what I'd been doing for 7 years, or where I'd slept the first winter, or whether I'd been all right. She asked if I'd be coming Saturday. She asked, twice, how big the house was. She wrapped both questions in so much warmth, you could almost miss the shape of them underneath. Then, near the end, gentle as anything. We're getting older, sweetheart. Family should be close. Close. She kept saying close. I said I'd think about it. I hung up and sat with it. Close. She kept saying that word to a woman she hadn't called in 7 years, so I did what I should have done as a child and never had the standing to do. I looked. I didn't open her texts for clues. I didn't need to. Some things are public. Yvonne sat with me at the office after hours, and we pulled the records anyone can pull. A foreclosure notice, with my parents' names and their address. The house they'd kept. The house with the locked door. The rest filled in from the open parts of the internet. My sister Whitney had spent the last few years posting a boutique. Ribbon cuttings, blessed, so grateful, hashtags about being self-made. The store had closed quietly months ago. The posts had stopped. The loans hadn't. A line of credit she'd defaulted on, $185,000, with my parents' names on it as co-signers. A second mortgage on the house on top of it. The bank had run out of patience. The sale was coming. Whitney had gone dark. The Blessed Family posts had simply stopped, the way a light goes off in a window. We pieced it together over an hour and 2 more cups of coffee, the glow of the screen on both our faces. The dates lined up like a confession. The boutique's last post, a sale, everything must go, a brave little exclamation point, landed the same week the bank filed its first notice. After that, nothing. No store, no posts, no Whitney. Yvonne read it all over my shoulder and sat back. "They're not coming back for you," she said. "They're coming back for the roof." "I know." "You don't owe them a room." "I know that too." I closed the laptop, but they're going to ask, and I want to be ready for the version of me that almost says yes. I looked at the foreclosure notice for a long time. My mother's name, my father's name, the address where my whole childhood lived behind a deadbolt. The people who threw me out had nowhere to go. I decided I would go to the celebration, not to ambush anyone. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about it since. The town had been told for 7 years that I was the girl who ran off and abandoned a dying woman. My grandmother had been called confused, in the end, by people who needed her to be. I would go to the one room where my mother's whole reputation lived, and I would let the truth stand up on its own feet, in front of the people whose opinion she'd spent her life arranging. I called Voss and asked him to come with me. As my attorney. "I'll come," I told him. "I'll bring the truth. I won't raise my voice." He was quiet a moment on the line. "You understand, it'll be public," he said. "People you grew up with. It can't be undone once it's said in that room." "I know." "Some people would rather settle quietly. It's cleaner." "She didn't keep it quiet when she put me out," I said. "She told the whole town a story. I'm just going back to the same room to finish it." I had 3 days. Then, before the party, they came to the gate. They wanted to perform family. I let them, for 3 more days. The gravel gave them away first. I heard the tires on the long drive before I saw the car, and I went out onto the front step with my coffee, because I wasn't going to be found hiding in my own house. The car stopped a few feet short of the gate. My father got out first, slower than I remembered, his hair gone white. Then my mother, in her good coat, smiling like she'd planned the smile in the mirror. She came right up to the iron bars and put her hand on them and looked past me at the house. "Look at this place, sweetheart." Her voice caught, real or rehearsed. I couldn't tell anymore. "Look how far you've come." My father stood back by the car with his hands in his pockets, surveying the roofline like an appraiser. I watched his eyes move across the house the way they'd once moved across my report card, totaling, deciding, finding the number. He didn't see a home. He saw square footage. Neither of them seemed to notice that the gate was closed, that I hadn't crossed the drive to open it, that we were having this conversation through iron. My mother's eyes were wet at the corners, and I'll never know how much of that was real. She'd always been able to summon it. It used to work on me. They smiled like the door had never closed. "It's good to see you," my mother said, and reached one hand through the gap in the gate, up toward my face, the old gesture, the warm, dry palm aiming for my cheek. I felt my stomach drop at the smell of her perfume. The same one, exactly the same, the one from the entryway 7 years ago. My whole body remembered it before my mind caught up. My father spoke for the first time. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask anything. He looked up at the second-floor windows and said, "Big house for one girl." It was the most he'd say to me all morning. 4 words, and not one of them a question. My father had a gift for that, for making your existence sound like a logistics problem. As if the rooms were going to waste, as if the natural correction was obvious, and only I was being difficult about it. Sweetheart, the word that always came before a knife. My mother's hand was still reaching. She lowered it finally and folded both hands at her waist and put on the soft church voice. "We've been talking, your father and I," she said. "We're not getting any younger, and this place, it's so much for one person." A small laugh. "We're family, Maren. We should live here too." I said nothing. She filled the silence the way she always had. "It's the natural thing. Family takes care of family." The phrase landed in my chest like a key in an old lock. Family takes care of family. I'd heard it at 14, when it meant I would give up my mornings. I'd heard it at 16, when it meant my afternoons. I'd heard it at the kitchen table the day they handed out my grandmother's money to everyone but me. It had only ever pointed one direction. Then, lower, with a glance back at the car, and "Don't embarrass us at the party, sweetheart. Saturday. People talk." There it was, the room, the deadline, the roof. They wanted my house. They had no idea what I had. I looked at my mother for a long moment through the bars of the gate I'd paid for. Then I stepped back, out of reach of her hand, and I said 5 words. "I have Grandma's last letter." She went white. It wasn't a slow thing. The color left her face all at once, the way water leaves a sink. Her hand came up to her collar. My father said, "What letter?" But she didn't answer him, because she already understood something he didn't, and I watched her understand it. She knew exactly what that meant. I didn't open the gate. "I'll see you Saturday," I said, "at the party." My father started to say something about being reasonable. "Now hold on, let's all." And I let him run out of road. My mother didn't argue. That was the tell. The mother I grew up with always argued, always had one more soft sentence to smooth a thing over. This time, she put a hand on his arm and turned him toward the car. She'd stopped performing. She was calculating. They backed down the long drive, and for the first time in my life, I watched them leave instead of being the one left. I stood at the gate until the car turned out of sight, and then a while longer, in the quiet, listening to my own gravel settle. 3 days until the party. I never opened the gate. They opened a much bigger door at the party. The church hall smelled like coffee and lemon cake. My mother had baked it herself, of course. Her famous lemon cake, on a glass stand at the center of the long table, the recipe she'd claimed as her own for decades. The room held maybe 85 people, aunts and uncles, cousins I half remembered, 2 pews worth of the congregation, Pastor Dale Kearns, moving through it, shaking hands. A banner read, 30 years. Beneath it, a smaller table held a framed photo of my grandmother. I came in quietly and stood near the back. Heads turned. The whispering started. The girl who ran off, look, she came. I recognized faces I hadn't seen since childhood, older now, arranged into the polite masks people wear at things like this. A few of them had the grace to look uncomfortable when they saw me, which told me they remembered the version of the story they'd been handed and had never once questioned it. Voss came in a minute behind me, in a gray suit. and found a chair along the wall, a slim leather folder on his knee. He caught my eye once and gave the smallest nod. We'd agreed I would speak first. He would only stand if he was needed. We both knew he'd be needed. My mother took the small microphone near the cake. She was good, I'll give her that. She thanked everyone for 30 years of love. She talked about family as a garden you tend. And then, with her eyes finding me at the back of the room and her voice going tender, she pivoted. Some of you know we've had an empty chair in this family for a long time, she said, and I want you to know. We never stopped being a family. We even saved a place for Marin. The door was always open. A few people turned to look at me, soft-eyed, ready to be moved. My mother, she went on, nodding at the framed photo, God rest her, would have wanted us all together. That's all I've ever wanted, to be together again. She told them the story she'd always told. I crossed the room to the microphone. The whispering changed pitch. I'd like to say something, I said, about Grandma. My mother's smile held, but her hand found the edge of the table. I didn't raise my voice. I took the folded letter out of my bag, and I unfolded it, and I read. You were the one who stayed, the one who held the cup to my mouth at 3 a.m. The room had gone still. I made sure that counts. Talk to Mr. Voss. He drew it up. That's not real. My mother's voice cut across the hall, too loud, a half step into panic. Head swung back to her. She caught herself, lowered it, spread her hands to the room. She was confused at the end. My mother was very confused. That could say anything. The girl could have written it herself. I lowered the letter. I didn't argue. Then Mr. Voss stood up. He didn't hurry. He walked to the front with the folder, and he opened it on the table beside the lemon cake, and he laid the pages down one at a time, and the room leaned in. The original will, signed, witnessed, the bank statement, a name on it, an account emptied, a photograph of a check, $500, 2 words on the memo line. My name is Harlan Voss. I'm Marin's attorney, and I drew up Opal's will. His voice carried without effort. This will is valid. It was hidden, and it was refiled weeks ago. Nobody moved. Opal left half her estate to her granddaughter. A separate account, in Marin's name, was emptied while Marin was a minor. The probate 7 years ago was filed as though no will existed. He squared the pages. There is a court date. There will be restitution, roughly $212,000. He didn't raise his voice for any of it. He didn't have to. He laid each page down like a man dealing cards he already knew would win. And the room read them upside down and sideways, and understood anyway. Somewhere to my left, an older man muttered, "Good Lord." A woman put her hand over her mouth. The framed photo of my grandmother sat at the front of it all, and I had the strange feeling she was finally being allowed to finish a sentence she'd started 7 years ago. The room went very quiet. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then a chair scraped, somewhere near the middle. A cousin half stood and sat back down. The framed photo of my grandmother watched the whole thing from the little table. My mother reached for me. Her hand came up off the table and crossed the space between us. The old gesture, fingers spread for my cheek, and her face had broken open into something I'd waited my whole childhood to see, and now felt nothing about. "Sweetheart, please!" Her voice cracked, wet. "You don't understand. We did what we had to do. You weren't, after everything I did for you." My father's voice came in over hers, hard. "This is a celebration. You've humiliated your mother in front of—" He looked around for allies and found people looking at their hands. No one came to his side, not one person in 85. That silence was its own verdict. I caught my mother's wrist before her hand reached my face. I held it there, in the air between us, and I lowered it. "Don't," I said. The room was watching. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I looked at the woman who had kissed my cheek and locked the door. And for the first time in my life, I did not call her mom. "Sandra," I said, just her name. She saw me. You didn't. She had no answer. She'd spent 30 years arranging this room's opinion of her, and the room was rearranging itself in real time, and there was nothing on the little typed page to hide behind, because the page was on the table now, in everyone's sight. Somewhere behind me, a woman murmured to the person beside her, "That's the girl who built Marigold, the one the county rated best," and I let it travel the room without turning around. There was an empty chair near my parents' table with Whitney on a little place card, and it stayed empty, and people noticed that too. I was never the problem. If you've ever been the one who did the caring and got handed the bill for it, this part is for you. You're allowed to love people and still refuse to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. Tell me in the comments, where did you finally draw the line? Then stay for the last few minutes, because this is the part nobody warned me about. The room turned slowly, the way a tide does. A chair pushed back from my parents' table, then another. An aunt I'd loved as a child stood, hesitated, and came across the room to stand beside me. A cousin followed. Pastor Dale set down his coffee and walked over, and he didn't make a speech. He just put a hand on my shoulder, brief and steadying, and let everyone see him do it. It wasn't dramatic. That's the part I didn't expect. No one shouted at my mother, no one threw a drink. People simply stopped meeting her eyes, and a few of them stood, and the standing was louder than any shouting could have been. A man I didn't recognize quietly picked up his coat. The pastor's wife lifted the framed photo of my grandmother off the little table and, after a moment's thought, carried it over and set it on the table by me. Voss closed the folder. He looked at the framed photo of my grandmother, then at me. "She trusted the right person," he said. The aunt beside me had wet eyes. "We were told you left," she said. "We should have asked where you went. I'm sorry, we should have asked." I didn't say it was all right, because it wasn't, and she didn't ask me to. She just stood beside me, which was the apology that counted. Across the hall, an old friend of my grandmother's, a woman from her church circle, gray and small and furious in the quiet way of the very old, walked up to the front table, looked at the will and the bank statement laid out beside the lemon cake, and then looked at my mother for a long moment. She didn't say a word to her. She turned to me instead. "Opal talked about you," she said, "right up to the end, the granddaughter who stayed. We all thought you'd moved away and forgotten her." Her mouth tightened. "She never said a word against you, not once." Around my mother, the chair sat empty. She stood near her famous lemon cake with my father, in a clearing that widened as people quietly chose where to stand. The foreclosure would go through. Everyone in that room knew the house was already gone. The restitution would follow. None of it was a thing I had to announce. It simply became true in front of them. 7 years late, the town finally saw it. I didn't win an argument. I gave them back the truth. We talked once more, privately, in the hall after most people had gone. My parents asked to live with me. Not in those words. My mother dressed it in family and forgiveness, and your grandmother would have wanted. But underneath the words was the same thing it had always been. The roof. They had nowhere to go, and they'd come to the one person they'd thrown away, because they'd run out of everyone else. I let them finish. "You won't live in my house," I said. My mother's face started to crumple. "But you're going to need care," I went on even, "and you're not going to get it from me at 3 a.m. the way I gave it to her. I'll arrange it, professionally, through Marigold or a partner, paid, scheduled, with people who are good at it." I looked at my father, who had spent my childhood deciding what a nursemaid was worth. That's what caring costs. I know the number now. He didn't have anything to say to that. For the first time in my life, my father looked at me and seemed to be doing arithmetic that wouldn't come out in his favor. I picked up my bag. The gate, in my mind, was already open behind me. The one I'd kept closed 3 days before. The one I would walk back through tonight to a house that was only mine. Family isn't a key to someone else's house, I said, and I left them in the hall with the cake. A few months later, the kitchen smells like lemon and butter. It's summer. The windows are open and the light comes in low and yellow, the way it used to in the afternoons. My grandmother's quilt is folded over the back of the kitchen chair. On the counter, cooling on a rack, is a lemon cake made the way she made it. The stained index card propped against the tin in her slanted hand. The real recipe, the one my mother never actually had. There's a small gathering out back. A few people from Marigold, Yvonne with a paper plate, Mrs. Okafor's daughter, a couple of the aides who started the year we opened. Someone's laughing about something. The marigolds I planted in the spring came up crooked and stubborn and bloomed anyway. I cut the cake into slices the size of 2 slices. I think about the tin, the false bottom, the 7 years it kept its secret until I was finally still enough to find it. I think about a hand finding mine in the dark and a voice that knew exactly what it was leaving me and exactly who would understand it. These are yours, Maren, all of them. She was right. They were. All of them. The tin is still on my shelf. So am I. Proof I was never the problem.